The philosophical traditions we have been taught often seems to follow a hierarchical progression of ideas, giving the impression that thinkers walked a certain path to bring us to where we are today. In many ways, the academic discipline of philosophy, as it's taught in universities, appears to be built on this narrative. After spending years trying to understand it, I still can't pin down a precise definition of philosophy, and perhaps that's the point. It's something so broad and open-ended that any attempt to define it strictly would miss the essence. Yet, despite this apparent openness, academic philosophy often feels quite narrow. It tends to focus on a selected group of thinkers whose ideas are repeated and analyzed endlessly. While their values in engaging with the past, after all, understanding previous ideas is a good way to develop new ones, treating these inherited distinctions and frameworks as sacred or final can be limiting. It risks turning philosophy into a mere exercise in repetition rather than a space for fresh thoughts. Let me give you an example. About a year ago, I met someone who was a sociology teacher. I asked him what he thought about the commonly discussed divide between the West and the East, a distinction that many people refer to when talking about civilizations. He had a lot to say, but what struck me was that everything he said was grounded in a very specific framework, one that felt detached from other disciplines or ways of thinking. It became clear that his entire perspective was shaped by what he had encountered during his sociology studies. He broke everything down into categories, and at the base of it all was the distinction between East and West. This reminded me of something I had experienced often while reading secondary philosophical or historical sources. For the sake of convenience, writers tend to group thinkers or traditions into neat categories, and while that might make things easier to explain, it often comes at the cost of oversimplifying or even distorting the individuality of each thinker. I asked him what he actually meant when he used the term the West. Where does it begin and where does it end? He made a fair point. He said that we often infer it from political structures that we see in the world. To that, I responded by asking, if it all rests on political structures, then didn't Alexander the Great dissolve this supposed divide when he conquered the Persians? That led us into a deeper discussion, one that became increasingly interesting as we started to explore how certain ideas, which have no clear face or represent no concrete reality, somehow become deeply ingrained. These abstract notions evolve into seemingly absolute truths, even though they often arise from earlier ideas that had no empirical basis to begin with. This is something I also notice in the way modern philosophy is taught as a discourse. It often feels like a discipline where we were trained to imitate previous thinkers rather than truly thinking for ourselves. Only a few seem to step beyond that pattern to offer something genuinely new, or perhaps it's just the nature of the world that among many, only a few ever truly attempt to contribute something original. The idea I mentioned earlier that we construct abstract spheres without no real face has shaped and often deformed our thinking for generations. We have placed rigid labels on thinkers and traditions that were never so clearly defined. For example, we have made Plato into a pure idealist, which oversimplifies his work, or we have grounded a variety of very different thinkers under the banner of existentialism, when many of them never identified with that label or didn't belong in that category at all. This rigid categorization is likely why we find thinkers who attempt to dissolve these philosophical boundaries. Take Sophocles, for instance. His portrayal of family and fate in Oedipus transforms what could be seen as a social structure into something mysterious and fluid, challenging the clear-cut moral and metaphysical divisions of his time. Anyways, it's true that dividing things makes it easier for us to understand, but in doing so, we often erase the humor, the mystery, and the individuality of life and of the person, someone who, in truth, no one fully understands. And what have we been doing for ages, really, other than interpreting the ideas of the past, trying to give those old structures a new sense of belonging, as if attaching ourselves to them is what it means to live? These divisions, when rooted in distinctions of language and idea formation, can certainly be useful, but when they become fixed, when they turn into unbreakable idols, they become dangerous. They begin to shape not only how we think, but what we are allowed to think. And while this approach might make sense to many, it really leads to genuine contribution. More often, it brings the kind of stagnation we are seeing now. Thank you for listening, and please share what you think about this. Thank you so much for watching.